The Weight of What Remained. Chapter 1. The hotel bar was almost empty when Isabelle removed her wedding ring and placed it beside the untouched drink. Not hidden, not dramatic, simply set down between them like a fact that had finally grown too heavy to carry. Julian stared at the ring for a long moment, then at her. "This," he said quietly, "is exactly how people our age destroy themselves." Outside, rain blurred the harbor lights into trembling gold. The windows shivered each time the wind came off the water. Somewhere behind the reception desk, a piano recording played too softly to identify. Isabelle leaned back against the leather booth and studied him with tired affection. "You always did confuse desire with catastrophe. That's because I survived both." She smiled at that, not fully, enough to suggest memory. 26 years earlier, that smile had nearly convinced him to leave another woman standing alone in a church vestibule with flowers in her hands and terror in her eyes. He had not done it. He had married Claire exactly as planned. Isabelle had married Daniel 8 months later out of what Julian suspected was exhaustion more than love. And now here they were, two careful people in their 60s sitting in a hotel bar pretending the past had not been patiently waiting for them. The bartender passed near their table. Isabelle touched her glass but still did not drink. "How long are you staying in the city?" she asked. Tomorrow was the plan. "And now?" Julian looked at her ring. "I haven't decided." Silence settled comfortably for a moment. They had always been good at silence. Even young, they had understood that intimacy was not built from speaking constantly. It came from recognition, from noticing what another person edited out of themselves. Isabelle turned toward the window. "It still surprises me," she said, "how quickly life becomes something you manage instead of something you choose. You say that like you weren't excellent at managing it. I was excellent at appearing calm. That's not the same thing." "No," she said softly. "It isn't." Couple entered from the rain. Young, wet coats, bright faces. They carried the atmosphere of people still convinced that love was primarily about being understood. Julian watched them briefly. "You know what I envy about the young?" he said. "They still believe timing can be overcome." He looked back at her. "You used to believe that. I used to believe many stupid things. That we loved each other wasn't stupid." The words landed heavily between them. Isabelle lowered her eyes. Her hand moved unconsciously toward the ring on the table, but she stopped before touching it. "You can't say things like that now." "Why?" "Because now they matter." Julian gave a quiet laugh. Not amused, defeated. "They always mattered." She looked at him then, really looked at him. Age had changed him elegantly and cruelly at once. His face had become sharper over the years, less protected. The confidence people once mistook for certainty had worn thin enough to reveal the loneliness beneath it. When they were younger, women had wanted Julian because he seemed impossible to wound. Time had corrected the misunderstanding. "You loved Claire," Isabelle said. "I did. And you stayed." "Yes." "Then don't rewrite your life because we're old and nostalgic." "Nostalgia is sentimental," he replied. "This is something else." She turned away again. That frightened him more than anger would have. The waiter refreshed the candle at their table. A tiny practical flame. Isabelle watched it flicker. "Daniel died angry with me," she said suddenly. Julian remained still. She had not mentioned her husband all evening. "What happened?" "A long illness." She paused. "Toward the end, anger became easier for him than fear." "And for you?" "For me?" She considered the question carefully. "For me, caretaking became easier than honesty." Julian said nothing. The rain intensified outside. Water moved down the glass in restless silver lines. "I thought," she continued, "that devotion would erase certain things. I thought if I stayed long enough, worked hard enough, forgave enough, eventually my life would feel entirely inhabited by me. And it didn't." "No." Her voice was calm. That was the terrible part. No self-pity, no performance. Just the plain exhaustion of a woman who had spent decades negotiating with herself. Julian reached for his drink at last. "What about your children?" he asked. "They love me." That sounded rehearsed. "It is rehearsed." A faint smile crossed her mouth. "Mothers rehearse gratitude because the alternative sounds monstrous." He watched her carefully. "You're unhappy." "No," she shook her head slowly. "Unhappy is temporary. I think I'm simply finished pretending that sacrifice automatically becomes virtue." The pianist changed somewhere beyond the lobby speakers. Something slow and old-fashioned. Julian remembered another piano. A summer house on the coast of Maine. Isabelle barefoot at 29. Sitting cross-legged on the floor in an oversized sweater while stormlight filled the room blue and silver. She had been playing badly and laughing at herself. He had been watching her instead of reading the book in his lap. At some point she had stopped playing and said, without looking up, "If we do this, everything changes." And because he was a coward disguised as a decent man, he had answered, "Not necessarily." Even now, decades later, the memory embarrassed him. Some lies survive because they are useful. Others because admitting them would require dismantling the entire architecture of one's life. "You disappeared after Claire's funeral," Isabelle said quietly. Julian blinked back into the room. "I know. I wrote to you. I know that too." "Then why didn't you answer?" Because grief had stripped him down to the least admirable version of himself. Because he had spent 40 years building a life defined by restraint, responsibility, predictability. And the moment Claire died, every unfinished feeling he had ever buried began moving inside him like trapped animals. But he could not say that aloud. Instead he said, "I didn't trust my reasons for wanting to see you." Isabelle nodded once as if she had expected exactly that answer. "Do you trust them now?" "No." That surprised her into laughter. A real laugh this time. Brief, helpless, beautiful. Julian felt the old danger immediately. Not desire alone. Recognition. The far more permanent problem. She wiped lightly beneath one eye. "God," she murmured. "We really are too old for this." "That's the only reason it matters." The bartender announced last call. Neither of them moved. The room had emptied gradually around them until only two businessmen remained near the far wall, speaking in low, exhausted voices. Rain continued against the windows with stubborn precision. Isabelle picked up her wedding ring at last and rolled it slowly between her fingers. "When Daniel proposed," she said, "I almost told him no." Julian held her gaze. "Why didn't you?" "Because you had just become a father." He closed his eyes briefly. Not from shock. From the familiar ache of consequences arriving long after their causes. Claire had given birth early that autumn. A daughter with dark hair and Julian's serious expression. He remembered holding the infant while Isabelle stood beside the hospital window holding flowers she never handed him directly. She had smiled at Claire, complimented the baby, stayed 12 minutes exactly. 3 weeks later, she accepted Daniel's proposal. "You should have told me," Julian said. "To what end?" "I don't know. That's precisely why I didn't." He wanted suddenly, violently, to touch her hand. The impulse startled him with its intensity. At his age, desire usually arrived softened by caution. This felt young in the worst possible way, immediate, irrational, humiliating. Instead he asked, "Were you ever happy with him?" "Yes," she said at once. The certainty in her voice hurt more than hesitation would have. "I loved him differently." "But you loved him." "I did." Julian nodded slowly. That mattered. He needed it to matter. People liked stories where love remained pure through time, untouched, waiting faithfully beneath the surface of ordinary years. Real life was more complicated and far crueler. Isabelle had loved her husband. Julian had loved his wife. Their marriages had not been mistakes, which meant whatever existed between them could not be dismissed as simple tragedy. It was choice, repeated over decades. "You know what the strange thing is?" Isabelle said. "What?" "I stopped missing you for a long time." He looked down at the table. "And now I wake up at 3 in the morning feeling 28 years old and terrified." Neither spoke after that. The The silence expanded carefully around them. At the reception desk, someone laughed. An elevator opened and closed. Rain traveled endlessly through darkness beyond the harbor. Finally, Julian said, "Come upstairs with me." There it was. Not elegant, not seductive, just honest. Isabelle stared at him without expression. The candle flame moved between them. "You think this is about sex?" she said quietly. "No." "Then what is it about?" He answered too quickly. "You already know." She stood abruptly and walked toward the windows. Julian remained seated. He watched her reflection in the glass. The graceful line of her shoulders beneath the dark wool coat. The slight fatigue in her posture she would once have hidden from everyone. Age had made her less careful about appearing invulnerable. Oddly, it made her more beautiful. After a long moment, she spoke without turning around. "Do you know what I did the morning after Daniel died?" "No." "I made coffee for 2 people." Julian said nothing. "I poured his cup automatically." Her voice remained steady. "Then I stood in the kitchen looking at it until the coffee went cold because part of me still believed love meant continuing habits after meaning disappeared." She finally faced him again. "I don't know how to begin again at this age." "You don't begin again," Julian replied softly. "You continue differently." A shadow crossed her face then. Not disagreement, fear. "You say that as if reinvention is noble." "No. I say it because survival is." She walked back to the table slowly. When she sat down this time, she seemed closer somehow, though the distance between them remained unchanged. "I used to think," she said, "that restraint made people moral. And now I think restraint simply makes people old." Julian smiled despite himself. "That sounds like something you practiced saying alone." "I did." Another silence. But something had altered beneath it. The careful civility between them had begun thinning into honesty, and honesty carried its own momentum once invited into a room. Julian glanced toward the elevators. "I have an early train tomorrow." "You're still leaving?" "I'm trying to behave responsibly." "And how's that working out for you?" A tired laugh escaped him. "Poorly." She studied him with unbearable tenderness. Then, very softly, "Claire knew about me." The words entered him like cold water. He stared at her. "What?" She never said it directly, but she knew. "That's impossible." "Julian." "No," he shook his head immediately. "Claire would have said something." "Not necessarily." He felt suddenly unsteady. His wife had been dead 18 months. In grief, memory became unstable territory. Certain moments sharpened painfully while others dissolved completely. But now, as he sat across from Isabelle in the dim hotel bar, fragments began rearranging themselves. Claire asking once, lightly, "Does she still write to you?" Claire watching him too carefully at a dinner party years ago while Isabelle crossed the room. Claire saying, near the end of her illness, "There are parts of you even kindness never reached." God. He pressed a hand briefly against his mouth. Isabelle's voice gentled. "She loved you very much." "Yes," he said hoarsely. "And I think she understood that loving someone does not always mean possessing the entirety of them." He looked away sharply toward the rain-dark harbor. Guilt moved through him with fresh precision. Not because he had betrayed Claire physically. He never had. Because emotional fidelity was more difficult to measure and perhaps more important. "You should have told me," he whispered. "She was dying." "That isn't the point." "No," Isabelle said. "It is exactly the point." Julian stood suddenly and crossed toward the windows himself now, unable to remain still. The city shimmered indistinctly below. Behind him, Isabelle remained seated. "Do you know what frightens me?" he asked after a moment. "What?" "That if I had met you first, I would have ruined both our lives." A pause. Then, "You say that like you didn't ruin them anyway." He turned. Neither smiled. The honesty between them had become almost unbearable now. Not dramatic. Worse. Precise. Julian walked back slowly. When he sat down again, their knees nearly touched beneath the table. "I don't know what happens next," he admitted. "That makes 2 of us." But I know I don't want tonight to end with another goodbye we pretend is maturity. Isabelle closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, something inside her appeared, exhausted from resisting. Julian. He waited. The rain softened at last against the windows. I came here tonight intending to say no to you, she confessed. And now? She looked at him for a very long time before answering. And when she finally spoke, her voice was almost inaudible. I don't remember why anymore.